Our third lecture today is from epistemology of brain to heart-mind epistemology. What does epistemology mean? Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that studies the way we come to know. There are different ways in which we come to know, and these ways in which we come to know very much define what we're able to know and what we consider possible to know, and therefore what kind of questions we ask and how we align ourselves in the knowledge process. And so when we begin to talk about heart-mind coherence, we have to begin really at the foundation to appreciate why this shift towards an appreciation of consciousness in the world at this time is still so difficult. We have to really understand what is at stake here in this transition. So, as you already know, this lecture series takes a very structured and systematic approach to examining the intersection between the psychological and the spiritual. Why? Because it is clear that our current understanding is not delivering us. Despite our unprecedented level of education and information, we are severely ailing as a world, ever more deeply. And so are our relationships to society and to this magnificent planet. As I said in the first lecture, we really do not know what is living us. So each lecture is structured as a graded sequence, reviewing very quickly what has been looked at so far so that we can really rethink and then add a few more building blocks. So we began by trying to understand the experience of health. That was the first lecture, the experience of health. Of course, we only began. We're going to keep coming back to these themes more deeply. We concluded in that first exploration that health is a lifelong integration at the very intersection of the psychological and the spiritual. So once again, that health is a lifelong integration at the very intersection of the psychological and the spiritual. We suggested that health has to do with the experience of coherence, of things actually making sense and feeling right. And that in fact translates into the chemistry and physiology of how we function. We also suggested that coherence involves every level of our existence. So it involves the material and the embodied, as well as the intellectual, the environmental, the social, and ultimately the spiritual levels of our experience. So the degrees of coherence that we experience or incoherence affect the state of our brain, heart, and body. And so we really cannot think of health as just the health of the body. In our second talk, we moved to an exploration of the nature of human minds. And some people have asked me why? Why from health to the human mind when we have such a disaster on our planet? Because it is through the proper use of our minds that we come to understand, connect, make sense, and find coherence. And so how we relate to our minds in a fundamental way defines how we relate to each other and to all forms of life that sustain us. So a careful examination of the proper understanding of mind and its development is actually quite foundational. So how do we know if we have the proper understanding of mind? In life, as you know, each thing is known by its fruit. A proper understanding of mind would put us in a harmonious and meaningful relationship with all living things on our planet, since mind mediates human relationships. Well, apparently our current understanding of mind has led to a rather exploitative and reductionistic relationship to each other, to society, and to our planet. Mind, which for centuries was viewed as the most noble tool of the human spirit, gradually, with the boom of courageous and diligent science, became reduced to the workings of the brain. As a social scientist, I have the greatest respect for science, for the curiosity of the human spirit to study, to analyze, often at high personal cost, and also for the dedication and perseverance it takes to grasp the most intricate processes of nature. But where we lost our way is that gradually a new ontology emerged, a new worldview, a rationalistic worldview which understands reality to mean strictly material reality. Ontology, or how we understand the nature of reality, the nature of being, as well as categories of being, how we think about what's real and important, limits what we pay attention to and what we come to know. In other words, ontology defines epistemology. Our worldviews define what we try to understand and how we try to understand it. The epistemology that emerged and that has increasingly dominated our lives is that only the physical is real. Neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander has called this physicalist scientific worldview, the physicalist scientific worldview. That's what we've learned to call realism. This realism appears to correlate very strongly with an unprecedented spike in neurotic and psychotic suffering in the world. After 100 years of trying to describe how consciousness arises out of the workings of the human brain, there is not yet even a hint of a hypothesis of the actual pathway through which neuronal firings may be creating consciousness. Not even a hint of a hypothesis. Nonetheless, mainstream science continues to ignore a rapidly growing body of evidence of phenomena that cannot be understood within our current ontology, within our current worldview. And as you know, there will be lectures at which we will return specifically to that body of evidence. It's not our focus today. As a result, on the edges of mainstream physicalist science, a new scientific understanding is rapidly taking shape. According to that, as we discussed in our second lecture, mind is better understood not as produced by our brain, but as a much larger embodied and interpersonal process, related to but not limited to the functioning of the brain. We discussed how our minds develop through a process of integration, bumping moment by moment against tendencies towards chaos and rigidity. Many of you saw the chart and received the chart of the river of integration, and that's included in our second talk on the video. We explain this lifelong development as a process of ongoing learning through experience, which means differentiating new aspects of understanding and subsequently linking those new elements together with the rest of what we know and understand, in other words, integrating. So differentiation and integration is the path of developing mind. We acknowledge that an ever deeper integration of our minds needs quiet downtime and happens best through contemplative spiritual practices such as centering prayer, meditation, and contemplative spiritual readings, which allow us to construct a deeper and more comprehensive meaning of our lives. Especially in a modern world so flooded by fragmented information and even more fragmented human interactions, and relying on such a hectic pace of performance, we are experiencing more and more overwhelm, which is a sign of mental chaos and inability to meaningfully integrate our experience. To reclaim our sense of agency in this rapidly expanding global world, and in the overwhelming experience of this rapidly expanding global world, we need to take a solid and deep hold of practices, essentially spiritual practices, that may involve music, literature, and meditations, readings, which help give meaning to all that we do. And this is exactly where psychology meets spirituality. Psychological integration, which is the essence of health, is a meaning-making process of deepening connections. And humanity's deepest path to meaning and connection has always been, and continues to be, a spiritual understanding of life. Of course, we know that this fact has been profoundly questioned by modern science, which has attempted to dismiss meaning and examine health strictly as a function of brain and behavior. The results have been a proliferation of very helpful knowledge, but an utter inability to integrate, to come up with an integrated understanding of health. We also discussed that when already established connections of knowledge and understanding are held too rigidly, they are not able to accommodate new learning and understanding, and then minds drift into rigidity. Examples of that are both dogmatic materialist science and dogmatic religion. When either of those become our frame of reference, we find ourselves assimilating new insights into our existing beliefs, without allowing new learning to call into question existing convictions and to loosen and modify existing links. Such rigidity prevents the forward motion of living and meaning-making and renders our response to life predictably reactive, disconnected, defensive, closed, and even hostile. Examples of that are the ongoing competition among religious perspectives, as well as the refusal of dogmatic science to acknowledge 100 years of scientific findings, which cannot be explained within the current paradigm. Both chaos and rigidity are experiences that we all share as humans. Experiences that point us back to the central fact of adult living, the fact of our free will to choose in each next moment to recommit ourselves to the flow of integration. In other words, all of us experience moments of chaos and rigidity and bump against those one moment at a time. But that is also our opportunity to notice and to reorient ourselves towards processes of integration. Exercising a free will. This fact of free will is yet another way in which psychology meets spirituality. For much of 20th century psychology, in its efforts to become recognized as a behavioral science, along with other reductionist science, declared the fact of human free will non-existent. Free will and consciousness were relegated to philosophy and religion as speculations that carried little, if any, scientific reality. The fragmenting impact of this worldview on our minds can hardly be overstated. Nonetheless, mindfulness research as well as quantum physics are clearly showing the defining role of choice and free will in each micro moment of human life. So science is having to rethink itself with much greater humility and in a more meaningful conversation with spirituality. You're hearing here the theme of epistemological shift in the way we think about knowing. So as you understand, these talks are part of this process. It is not a surprise that after a century and a half of rapidly growing specialization and fragmentation of knowledge and proliferation of all kinds of materialist ideologies, the global health community is witnessing such a steep rise of mental illness due to extremes of chaos and rigidity. The rising tide of depression and anxiety can be associated with both dysfunctions of growing chaos and rigidity in our public spaces: social, educational, political, economic, environmental. On the far end of mental chaos, life becomes explosive, unpredictable, and filled with distressing intrusions of emotion, memory, and thought. On the far end of mental rigidity, there is often paranoid ideation, extreme hostility, and potential for aggression and violence. Languages, as we said in our first lecture, are vital to our development in terms of what they really encourage or discourage, mostly below the line of our awareness. We are immersed in language from the point of conception to our last breath. Those languages, first, the languages of our parents and caretakers and of our culture, both ethnic and social, later become, in our adult years, the languages of our professions, as well as the languages of the social and political circles in which we have chosen to operate. And all of them scaffold our experience of living. All these languages contain inherent worldviews and belief systems, which most of the time go unexamined. And anything that is leaving us unexamined controls us. So until we thoughtfully reflect on the languages we have been immersed in and exercise our power of understanding and free will to develop a comprehensively meaningful spiritual language that can help us integrate all of our experience of living, we are not fully agents of our lives. So, as we have discussed what may be a proper understanding of mind, we now move to the question of the role of heart in the integration of mind. When the role of heart is usually mentioned, people associate it with emotions. And indeed, psychology has learned a lot about the nature of human emotions. We understand that much of human insecurity is the outcome of often preconscious and persistent negative thinking, the product of the negativity bias of the lower evolutionary brains. We understand how variations of fear bring about experiences of rigidity and chaos that become mindsets that live us. We even understand the deeper formative processes of these fears in the early years and have developed a wide range of methodologies for repair through language processing and mind-body work. Yet, much of this work, until recently, was associated with mind understood as a product of the brain, and more recently, as a product of body and interpersonal interactions. Heart was only used as a metaphor. Two findings about the human heart are changing this understanding. One came through quantum physics into medicine and emerged as the field of energy medicine. This field has shown that in the dynamic, subtle energy system that we each are, the heart area creates an energy field far more powerful than the brain. In fact, the heart's electric field is 50 times stronger than the brain, and the heart's magnetic field is 3,000 times stronger than that of the brain. And of course, emotions have magnetic energy. And as we know, energy is information. The second finding is that recipients of heart transplants across many recorded and documented cases, show significant changes in personality in the direction of the heart donor. And since the heart has no center for linguistic processing, as does our left brain, apparently the heart stores and processes information in a way that we do not yet understand. It is hypothesized that a living heart may be storing and accessing information energetically in the hologram of the universe.
Could you say that again, please?
It is actually hypothesized that a living heart may be storing and accessing information energetically in the hologram of the universe. And of course, you will remember that a hologram is such a structure in which every individual part of that structure, every holon, carries the complete blueprint and information of the whole. So it may be that the heart is actually accessing information holographically. Spontaneous healing from terminal conditions, non-local healing, as well as the healing effect of pets on their owners, suggest that when the heart is activated and heart rhythms enter into sync with brain waves, powerful processes of integration are released. The clearest example of that is the consistent history throughout human civilization of spiritually illumined individuals exhibiting wisdom and understanding far more profound than that which we encounter in ordinary life. And all of them consistently teaching that it begins with the cultivation of a loving heart. What was for a long time understood as a metaphor is acquiring new concreteness through recent experiments with using breath and attention to activate heart. Interestingly, the impact is consistently that of people experiencing deep and encompassing positive feelings, much different in quality than the typical daily human emotions. And you've heard me mention the experiments of the Heart Math Institute. There's a lot of very good documentation on the IONS website of current research. There is a newsletter that you can receive when you become members of their most recent research findings. It is fascinating. In any case, these efforts to activate heart and have its rhythms get in sync with brain waves, which immediately generate deep feelings of love, gratitude, generosity, forgiveness, safety and security, etc. People report a very different experience with these deep feelings. It appears that these deep feelings reorder human perception. People feel much more all right in the universe, even though nothing in their immediate lives may have changed. And these shifts are reported almost instantly. So current research shows that in these states, people's energy fields expand dramatically. And as brain waves and heart rhythms become aligned, the body releases a powerful physiological and immune response, health response, which is released throughout the body. And people begin to exhibit in their behavior those 8 characteristics of coherence, which we spoke about last time. I'm going to remind you again that those were connectedness, openness, harmoniousness, receptiveness, engagement, a noetic sense of knowing, empathy, compassion, and empathy. In other words, coherence. So again, as people's hearts become activated and in sync with brain waves, people's perceptions of reality, feeling experience of life, and way of thinking, behaving, and operating becomes dramatically more coherent. And we can think of coherent in terms of these 8 characteristics. So, which of course we spoke last time, were something that Dr. Daniel Siegel established as the characteristics of the process of mind integration. So what does that mean? Activation of heart appears to facilitate instantly a high order of mind integration. Apparently, mind needs heart, a different epistemology than the way we've always thought. Much as sages throughout human history have taught us, the intentional activation of the human heart results in a whole new order of integration of mind. Hence, the essential common spiritual characteristics of all wisdom traditions. They always educate the mind about what reality really is and how to live optimally, but their most important emphasis is always on the human heart. So let's talk about an epistemology of heart-mind. Due to the prevalent belief that brain activity defines what we can know, the majority of people, including the majority of religious people, who believe in the concept of eternal life, are so influenced in their perceptions by physicalist conceptions of reality that the majority of us do not experience the rest that comes to the human heart from trusting in an interconnected, all-encompassing, and eternal universe. Even as we conceptually may believe in eternal life, much religious practices appear to be quite literally materialist in their understanding, and don't seem to find that deep rest, but rather manifest hostility, which we all know has discredited so much religion in the eyes of thoughtful people all over the world. And all of that has to do with how deeply we have been influenced, how deeply our thinking has been scaffolded by what we believe to be real. Even though there is ample evidence that most people at some point in their lives have some kind of premonitions, and by the way, these evidences are growing exponentially, that most people in their lives at some point or other experience premonitions, out-of-body experiences, or other encounters with non-local consciousness, in many cases near-death experiences or shared death experiences even. Most people who have these experiences are afraid to share them because of fear of being ostracized. And whenever they have tried to speak, they have been silenced by both scientists and religionists. I can refer you to a whole host of recent publications that is rapidly coming out with story after story. Every time a speaker stands up to give these kinds of talks, hosts of people come afterwards to share their individual experiences of premonitions, out-of-body experiences, remote knowing, remote healing, things that they could never share before. And that's what they always say: I've never told this to anyone because I was afraid to speak. So dominant is this worldview that is having to shift. In other words, in order to begin to experience the possibilities of heart-mind coherence, we need to become educated in the role of the human heart in restoring the nobility of the human mind as it strives towards coherence. And that's what we're looking at, the role of the human heart in restoring the nobility of the human mind as it strives towards greater coherence. When we strip religious teachings of rigid claims and listen deeply to the essential ontological and epistemological dynamics that they have consistently described over the centuries, we find the same affirmation that the wisdom-based life is heart-centered, and that the educated and refined mind works best as a humble servant and does not work so well as an arrogant master. When we cultivate this internal dynamic, one mindful moment of spiritual awareness at a time, we begin to transform our human suffering in the direction of a deepening experience of interconnectedness and eventually oneness in our complex diversity. We begin to experience and glimpse the reality of non-local, universal mind, which many people refer to as God. We also begin to glimpse the complex harmony of an ever-evolving, interconnected web of individual loci of consciousness. Each of us is a locus of consciousness. All 7 billion of us on this planet are individual locis of consciousness, interconnected, ever-evolving in our interconnectivity, and in that sense united in our diversity. And these are experiences which we begin to glimpse as we grasp this different way of thinking. And all of that in the context of the emergent reality of the physical realm, which we're constantly co-creating with our interactions. So at this point, I'd like to wind down my talk and give us this time a lot more opportunity for conversations and sharing in your groups of 4 or 5, after which we will have a chance to come back into the larger group so that we can all learn from each other and just receive more contributions here from everybody of thought, insight, and experience. So what I'd like to do is to open a space for us to experience together and process experientially a verse which I will share with you to read in your groups. I have 20 copies of this verse, so there'll probably be 2 per group or something like that. And what I'm asking you to do is to have 3 different people consecutively read this verse slowly and very clearly. And the rest of you try to center yourselves, preferably close your eyes, and if you would be willing, it's a very good practice to ground ourselves by actually making contact with our hearts. If you would put your hand on your heart area, press and really feel the warmth and the contact, and notice how your mind becomes skewed to really focus on what is happening here. Draw your breath through that place, and in that space, internally centered and grounded space, listen to the 3 readings, after which you may take some time to reflect on what you are experiencing as well as hearing. Let's remember that heart and mind work together best in sync. The heart experiences and discerns. The mind tries to grasp and understand what the heart has experienced and maybe even gleaned. The verse that I'm going to share with you is a verse taken from Baha'u'llah's Mystic Hidden Words. in the introduction to this first hidden word, which I'll share with you, and that's on your sheet, he explains that these hidden words actually represent eternal spiritual principles, which are at the core of every religion of the world, but they are expressed in this particular format in a very brief and succinct synthesis, which allows our modern minds to wrap ourselves around it, perhaps. So this is very much an unknown spiritual source, because it's a fairly new spiritual source of modern spiritual synthesis, which I find very helpful when we are trying to really look at what unites the diverse traditions of the world and what unites spiritual principles that people have gleaned through various practices, sometimes religious, sometimes not religious, but healing practices. So I'm going to hand you these sheets and invite all of you to now turn to your group